This episode is part of our series discussing the debate topics released for Debatable Open 2021. The motions can be found in the description along with timestamps for your convenience. Please enjoy. Welcome back to another episode of Debatable. For this episode, we are pleased to welcome Giano Libot, a two-time ESL quarterfinalist for Worlds, a two-time champion of Ateneo Debate Open, the champion and finals best speaker of LaSalle InterVarsity 2017, a finals where I was utterly defeated by Giano, and my past teammate for CSB IV back in the long-lost era of physical tournaments. So Giano is our motion contributor for international relations. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, good evening or good morning,
Hi.
however you're listening to this, whatever time.
Yeah, so we wanted to ask you what you felt was unique with IR as a theme, and what are the essential skills that debaters, especially novices, would need to have in order to
Mm.
reliably do well in these kinds of motions.
Yeah, I think IR in general is probably the most expected or conventional topic in most tournaments based from my experience. I think the uniqueness there is that you're always going to have an IR motion. Unlike, I guess, more niche or growing topics like gender and economic. Maybe economics is like second to IR, but IR is definitely out there. I think the other thing with IR that maybe not a lot of people think about is it's really, I mean, it's a large part of it is knowing how the world works. But I think the other thing that maybe people miss is just knowing how your community or society works. And we try so hard to think big, but in reality, a lot of what functions internationally also can be parallel to what happens in our direct communities.
All right, so I suppose that for novice debaters, maybe a tip would be to be less intimidated about it and think of it less in terms of like these big concepts like
Mm,
nation states, and more
mm.
about like these are just relationships between actors, just like you and I would have relationships
Yeah,
between actors as well.
yeah, I agree, and I think as I've probably grown more accustomed to debates and maybe even in the real world in general, a lot of what happens, you can see in the way it's reflected on specific direct societies that you have, whether it's your village association interacting with authorities, whether it's your organization or group interacting with other groups, and you can just I guess take it larger and imagine how that behaves, and you'll see that there's a it's not a surprise why sometimes even model United Nations can be seen as like a a step in the door into international
Mm-hmm.
relations.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's jump straight into the first motion, which is about the UK, specifically the decision to merge the Department for International Development and Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Beyond
Hmm.
the info slide, what other contexts would be like applicable or would be advantageous for a person, especially debater, to know specifically off the top off the top of my head? What is the main difference between these two departments in the first place, which gave rise to this motion? Like, why
Yeah,
is it so controversial?
I think, well, in general, for you to be successful in IR debates, you really need the matter load. And then extent,
Mm-hmm.
there's really no excuse to it. Like you can't wing
Yeah.
it. Maybe you can, but I think oftentimes if you really want to succeed, you really have the matter load. I think the basics here are really about aid in general or development aid, whichever type of or charity. It's the old school classic theme of should aid be conditional or unconditional. And I think what the merger in the UK's recent move represents is this combination of development and foreign policy being forged together. So the way uh, you know the UK government is gearing more towards right now is more towards fusing their development agenda with their foreign policy agenda. And that has a lot of consequences. So if you can imagine that maybe from your own organization's charity drives, should you tie those drives up with interests, like, I don't know,
Hmm.
being more specifically giving to an organization that you will benefit from, or a community that you will benefit from, whether that's going to have some exchanges or conditions, like we will give this in the hopes of you maybe opening up a trade port in that area. So it really is a classic debate of whether or not development aid should have strings attached, or interest attached, much as we try to pretend that there isn't, but I think
Yeah.
it matters.
All right, so I think that's very interesting that you mentioned like there's no way around it, but in I guess in real life and in the debate context, you can matter load as much as you want, but there are a lot of times you're just straight up unlucky that you just happen to not have matter loaded on this particular
Mhm.
topic. So assuming that there would be this kind of person who didn't know that kind of matter, like they didn't know anything that we just talked about,
Mm.
how do you recommend that they go about debating this motion?
Hmm. I think that's a really difficult question, but I think if I were in that position, I'd probably just look for context clues within the motion. So obviously, this is an aid motion, and any kind of aid motion, any motion that talks about development assistance, this will always be, I guess, at the heart of that conversation. So that could be your initial strand, even if you know nothing about UK aid in general, or this new organization called the FCDO. You try to think about that. You can also probably think about, British history, if you know a little bit about that. So context clues on that one. The other thing you can probably think about is, I guess, you can read the info slide quite well. It's quite evident in the way, the wording of the organizations themselves are being phrased. So,
Hmm.
DFID is development uh, centered. The name, it speaks for itself. Whereas the new organization is called FCDO, it's like Foreign Commonwealth something. So I don't know. That's another context clue. So I understand it's a really hard motion. I mean, it's not really hard, but it's just hard in the matter of context. But if you can get over the pronouns, it's actually a pretty straightforward, simple motion if you think about it.
Yeah, so I've read up on this motion quite a bit, and there were also issues on the composition of the new
Mm-hmm.
department, like how exactly
Mm-hmm.
you'll merge. So, besides the discussion of aid, besides the discussion of the practicality, what other arguments do you imagine government and opposition to be running, and what issues do you think they'd be focusing on for this debate?
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question. So looking at this motion, I'm thinking, if you're on affirmative side, you're probably thinking of this idea that the challenges of spending for aid in general, especially in today's society, that people are asking, what's the proof of investment? This isn't free money. This is paid for by the taxes of the British citizens. So governments are, even in a more demand to show that these kinds of investments mean something. So I guess you could be a bit more. Not thinking of arguments yet. I'm just thinking of an approach. You could be a bit more. Uh, what's the word? Cold, or a bit more practical, and say, let's face it. Aid isn't free. There's no such thing as free lunch. We need to make sure that these kinds of interventions are tied up to our foreign interests. And this kind of move definitely puts us in a more honest and practical direction. So I would probably start for that with government side. Um, the other thing is, I think you could also talk about, how it focuses more on impact, how it allows for uh, British society to have a bit more of a direct hand in the way aid can be, you know, directed. Because before, I think it matters when you think about the composition. Before, you had a very separate department, and they could pursue different interest oftentimes, even in, say, a country like Myanmar. Even if there's no like foreign policy interest there, but there's a human rights interest, the older composition of the program could still pursue projects there. But now with the move like this, you can see that those kinds of countries are a dead investment. Let's rather focus our goals on countries that really matter to us, or like can be proven to be more of a benefit towards us. So I think it's really more of angling this in the focus of why is it beneficial for the British government. I think for opposition, you go back to the heart of the aspiration for development aid. It should be centered on ideals and principles such as human rights, such as allowing societies to grow, trying to counter forces that erode democracies in many parts of the world. And sometimes those investments don't match up to foreign policy agenda, or there's no economic benefit towards, or there's no direct economic benefit rather towards investing there. So it's more of like a heartstring approach if you're on the op, whereas the government side is more of like a cerebral, in our pockets kind of
Mm.
approach.
Right. So thank you so much for that. So what's interesting to me is really the discussion on transition of power and the whole idea of like changing the philosophy of these departments, which I think is kind of bleeds into as well the second motion, talking about how exactly the US would transition in terms of their government and their presidency. So the second motion reads, this House believes that the incoming Joe Biden and Kamala Harris administration should um, offer Donald Trump and his allies amnesty from future prosecution in exchange for a peaceful transition of power. What specific instances and like pieces of matter do you think debaters should know regarding what the Trump camp is doing and what the Biden camp is doing for them to debate this motion properly?
Yeah, that's a good segue. I would say it's this motion is like going back to the aspirational world that we
Mm.
had, whereas the first motion really is transitioning towards like um, post post authoritarian
Mm.
regime. I think for this one, it's good to know that specifically that the administration of Donald Trump has had a lot of allegations of corruption historically. In fact, he's most of his cohorts have either been either on trial or have been already found guilty. I think just recently he even pardoned former national security advisor Michael Flynn.
Yeah.
Um, so those in general um, kind of highlight that there's something going on with that government. And so this motion, it's not actually a new motion. It's just new. The context is new, but we've seen this before. We've seen bargains for amnesty for dictators, quote unquote, before. Only this time, you're not really seeing a classic dictator, but you're seeing a new one, a new version, one that was democratically elected, and one that obviously is trying his very best not to make a peaceful transition of power. Whereas previous motions would probably look at post revolutions, wherein I don't know. In the past, we've had debates on um, the former dictator of Sudan um, e- e- exiting peacefully, or Robert Mugabe exiting peacefully, so that a new government can transition better. This one is more fresh because we're talking about Donald Trump and we're talking about an election that has already been won, but he's trying his very best to damage that kind of transition. So knowing about that pieces of history, and also knowing about the current trends, and the fact that um, it's been really hard for the incoming Joe Biden and Kamala Harris administration to hold. I mean, it was just a few weeks ago that the GSA allowed for them to access funds, but that's not the end of the deal. That just enables them to form a cabinet and get started. But the greater task is actually um, patching a very damaged society, which has, think about Joe Biden, 80 close to 80 million votes, but Trump also has like 72 million. So that's another, I guess, matter. Sorry, I'm just thinking about so many other things you can probably think that can help you out in this particular motion.
I thought it was very interesting because I didn't think of it that way. I haven't compared this motion to the previous motions about offering amnesty to dictators. And I remember
Mm,
I was a very new debater. Like I think it's just like 2011. This was the finals of
mm,
UADC or something.
Mm.
And it was about offering amnesty to dictators in exchange for uh, transition of power.
mm,
But would it be fair to say that in this debate, it's mostly about weighing the possibility of prosecuting Trump and sort of the urgency of a peaceful transition towards a Biden administration, and where, um, unlike in previous motions where it was about we really need to reestablish our institutions post revolution, this is more about like we really need to get the COVID situation in check.
yeah, I agree. I think that that could be an urgency, the COVID reality. The other thing is, if you look at American society and American democracies, they're very adversarial during elections, but that symbol of handing over actually gives a lot of administrations that necessary fresh start,
Mm.
and this allows for pockets of dissent or ramblings from different parts of society to climb over and maybe endanger a fresh administration. And they have one of the shortest handovers in most democracies. Like, but we're gonna see Trump. I mean, we're gonna see Joe Biden um, be inaugurated in January. Like, it's like super duper close.
Yeah.
So that sense of urgency is there. COVID is there, and I think the other thing that maybe some people may miss out is the forces that are drawn to Donald Trump. They're potentially very dangerous and incendiary too. Like, you're not just talking about the evangelicals or the far right, but you're also looking at the Proud Boys, those who are gun toting, and those that can be easily agitated by a disgruntled or desperate Donald Trump. So if he knows that in general he might be prosecuted in the future, he might use those kinds of forces to, I don't know, sow the dissent, so chaos to the point that he won't be prosecuted. So that's another thing. It's almost like I would say it's almost like a militia type of behavior
Yeah.
that you'll see in other dictators, but or other authoritarians. Although this one's just democratically elected. That's the weird thing.
From the perspective of Biden's camp, what arguments could you give for government and opposition as to why it might be strategic for them to consider this in the first place? So we already know that Trump has a lot of power, whether we like it or not, a lot of ability to cause um, and sow chaos into the transition if he so pleases. But like, what do you think is the chances of success for the Biden camp to actually like gain the peaceful transition, and what are the consequences if they choose not to and just continue to, I don't know what they're doing now, basically assert
Mm,
that they are
yeah.
going to prosecute Trump in the future?
hmm I think there's been discussions on that. Um, this is probably going to be a familiar term for most, but it's more about restorative or like retrospective justice. Like, what kind of justice are we trying to fight for? Is it saving American lives, citizens that are under COVID and those that desperately need a new kind of leadership? Or is the administration so bent on principles or on ideals and objectives that, regardless of whether Trump peacefully exits or not, they're gonna run a prosecution against him in the future, and that will have consequences, I think, because Trump's not gonna take it, peacefully if they do that, under the guise of or under the hanging sword of being prosecuted in the future. He's gonna try his best to either rally the new Republican leadership, which he's also trying to subvert right now as well. Like,
Mm.
put people in that respect him. They've even got like a code name now for some Republicans who don't side with them, like rhinos, Republicans in name only. So even the branding's already in check. So you can see that if there's going to be a potential, I think the counterfactual is if there's going to be a potential uh, case in the future, um, you are going to see, heated battles, not just on court, because I think the courts one is probably going to be a bit more complicated, but just on airwaves, on social media, on unusual discourse. He's going to, instead of allowing the Biden government to hold authority, he's going to assert uh, complications towards that. So I think if you're gov, you're really going to be harping more towards that, like being able to quote unquote unify the American society more, and that's more of a priority for you. Um, it's like a short term, a long term goal rather.
I can imagine opposition trying to argue something like, why can't we have both a peaceful transition and prosecution of Trump? Which to me, I mean, I want to ask you, would that be a valid or effective strategy on opposition? Or does this motion necessarily imply that there's a trade off, that you can only get one or the other? And if there is a trade off, how do you think opposition should, so I think, like, go around or maneuver around proving this trade off in their favor?
So I mean that kind of clash is possible. I just think that it's a particularly weak clash in a sense that the current facts and trends don't really match that peacefulness. It's not like Trump has stopped tweeting, and new alternative media forces like Newsmax or OAN have stopped airing their side of the fence. So it's unlikely. So I think the reality is that this is going to be a trade-off. But I think opposition isn't defenseless as well. Like so much of history, so much of American justice is also about this particular brand of making sure that people who make mistakes and who make crimes always have to pay. So being able to being able to forgive Donald Trump all of a sudden because of just needing to take hold of power peacefully, it's gonna damage the American institution. It's gonna damage their concept of justice. It's not gonna make the Democrats happy, especially those that are, I guess, more these emerging social democrats who really believe that Donald Trump is culpable of many things, corruption, fraud, uh, collusion with Russia, many other things. Even the deaths right now of uh, that that for them are cost of the mishandling of COVID-19. Think about what they feel if this is going to be the bargain that the Biden administration would entertain. So I think you're not really defenseless if you're opposition. You do have that particular material, and I think that's a hard trade-off to commit to.
Mm.
Like you'll have leadership on paper. You'll have this um, like a surface level, genuine partnership between two transitioning governments. But at what cost are we affording that? So I would take that if I were all.
Speaking of something that might sound or look good on paper, but might not necessarily be, good in practice, we can move on to the third motion, which is about,
Sure.
which is about the shift from the use of the United Nations peacekeeping forces in favor of more regional peacekeeping
Mhm.
forces, like military units organized by organizations like ECOWAS or NATO or the African Union. Um, would you think that, I mean, aside from the info slide, what other pieces of information or matter do you think that a novice debater should know um in order to debate this well? For example, like, what really is the difference between the UN as a peacekeeping force versus like regional peacekeeping forces, like in terms of their interests or how they operate, those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think this specific motion, even without that much matter, I think the contrast is already quite obvious. You have a military group that's regionally composed, whereas the UN can be, I don't know, quote unquote international. So I would expect the teams who debate this would at least know that the UN is international, so they can make an association. Though this is an international force, whereas the other one is probably regional. So on that level, you can already see, I guess, pros and cons. Regional would be they have advantage of knowing their neighbors. You know, they're a bit more. I guess there's a bit more of affiliation when it comes to operations. So they would, from a purely military perspective, they would know the terrain better. They would be able to assemble faster and quicker. Um, and also they represent a, I guess, projection of unified regional interests. So that's an advantage. Whereas the UN could oftentimes step in and assert more of an internationalist perspective. Um, for the UN, you could say that regional interests aren't always a good thing. You know, could be a competing region. There could be underlying ethnic or tribal or even um, sort of domestic um, interests. And you can have examples for this, but yeah, that could be one thing. So it's it doesn't mean that if you're regional, you're always good or you're always welcome. Especially if maybe somehow by history some of those regional forces represented invading forces before. So that's another thing. Resources could be, but I think the resource point is probably a bit moot. Like it depends on who has more information. I don't think it's a winning issue. But I think the mandate though is probably a winning issue. In a sense that the UN peacekeeping has a bit more of an international mandate. Like it's agreed upon by the United Nations Security Council. They're the ones that decide on the mandate of a peacekeeping force, whereas regional force is pretty much like how it says on the info sites. It's decided by a region. So you're gonna get a bit more of a consensus support from the mandate of peacekeepers as opposed to the regional forces. Um, what's the other thing? I think this motion also is about this classic issue with UN peacekeepers in general, that it has been historically underperforming. It's missed its mark, and even recently, if you've been reading the news, it's also been plagued with a lot of allegations on sexual abuse by foreign peacekeepers, especially in West Africa, the French-speaking side of Africa, where a lot of French or Algerian peacekeeping forces were sent. So, there's many things to think of peacekeeping in general needing to be reformed, and also the other comparison would be again also on the news a few years ago is the overperformance or almost seemingly glorified performance of some of the regional forces. Like if you just Google ECOWAS, you can see how it's been successful in forcing a peaceful transition in the Gambia, for example, when they sent forces there, and it forced the Gambian government to transfer power peacefully because of the threat of that particular regional group. And these were composed of forces from neighboring countries in West Africa, Senegal, um, among others, Nigeria. So yeah, that could be, I guess, one information I can think of.
You've already mentioned that this is a very classic discussion, and I've encountered this a lot in debate. I've also encountered this a lot in my poli classes back when I was in undergrad. So, what do you think would be possible extensions for debaters who have already encountered this in the past? Are there more recent events, for example, from this year? Is there a possible COVID angle, or is there a relationship to US elections you think that could be explored? Because I've been hearing in past debates attempts of doing so, and most times in IR they have been successful. So I'm kind of curious if there's a possibility of that being done here as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. There are a couple of emerging trends for peacekeeping that debaters that want to get good at this motion
Get good.
a bit a bit more. Maybe you can think of the slowly evolving leadership in the peacekeeping arena, especially with China investing a lot on peacekeeping and wanting to actually be premiered much bigger than they were before. So they're actually positioning insofar as just troop contribution and even in spending. So that's a particular trend, and this relates with China's interest in Africa as well, which where most of the peacekeepers are actually often being deployed. So that's one trend you can look at. The other thing is I think you can also look at how regional forces are historically or have been deployed historically, whether they've been
Mhm.
effective or not. Like I pointed towards the ECOWAS example, but even the recent deployments of NATO is also another issue with the
Mm.
kind of politics that they're facing. Maybe that changes with Joe Biden, but I think with the Trump administration, it also faced a lot of constraints. And the problem with I think regional, it's not a problem, but the interesting thing with regional forces is that they're very short-lived insofar as their missions are concerned. They're not like peacekeepers that stay there for quite some time and really act as a buffer. Oftentimes they're deployed for a very specific mission, and once they think that they've achieved that, then they leave. um, so you can ask yourself, is that reflective of the reality of conflicts these days? Like, are conflicts resolved in 2, 3, 4 months, or do some of them last longer? And in those cases, should we discard peacekeepers?
So I
That's
I think it's interesting you mentioned as well, like different actors that will come into play, like China's growing role, as well as the US's failure recently.
mhm,
Um, so who else do you think are actors you have to watch, especially when we're looking at regional peacekeeping forces? Because
mm,
so far we've talked about why the regional peacekeeping forces might be effective and why the UN peacekeeping forces might be effective or not. But what possible struggles do you think regional peacekeeping forces might encounter should we transition to it?
yeah. I think the one thing that you always have to be wary of when it comes to regional forces are regional interests, and that comes with rotations of leaders, profile of these particular countries, whether they're in a state of stability or not. And I think 2020 has definitely dawned on us that changes of leadership are already in place, or are coming, or if not, they're already in transition. Like, the Biden administration will have a very different attitude when it comes to international relations compared to Donald Trump. So maybe that would mean that there's a bit more stability with NATO in the future. With a group like NATO, because Joe Biden's gonna in his administration assert it a bit more, or maybe the EU with this new renewed relation with finally start investing a bit more on NATO. I think for Africa in general, you also have to note a couple of changes in the landscape as well. Like, Sudan's Omar al-Bashir died. Um, so there's a new government there. There's also an ongoing. So I don't know if people have read about this, but in Ethiopia, their prime minister was recently awarded with with the Nobel Peace Prize, I think last year. Now he's actually fighting a domestic war. I think Tigris or something. I forgot the actual name of that territory. It's like an autonomous territory in Ethiopia. That's like the irony of being awarded a Nobel Peace Prize and then now actually launching a full blown attack on a small city on its borders. So that's really the complication. In a way, you can say that uh, it's a bit more unpredictable when it comes to regional interests. Whereas the UN, for whatever it's worth, is a bit more predictable. Like, there's a degree of stability there that you can't find anywhere else.
I think that's I think that's really nice. I think we can end here. Um Thank you so much for agreeing to be a motion contributor for Debatable Open. It really means a lot, not just to us as organizers, but also to a lot of people who are really just honestly struggling with
IR.
IR and just wanna know more about how to be able to debate these kinds of topics. Um, thank you so much. I think that's it for
No,
this.
no, we have one last question
Oh,
actually. So we know everyone's struggling with IR to
yeah,
different
yeah,
degrees. Like regardless of how much you've read up, there will always be motions you encounter that might just stump you, or
yeah, yeah.
like no matter how many times you encounter the same motion, there will always be someone who knows more, and it can be intimidating to a lot of novices. So what advice can you give to debaters who are just starting their novice journeys, whether they're encountering IR motions or just any other motions that might be scary to them?
Yeah, I would say, always bring an almanac, or buy an almanac. I never actually, I wouldn't say that I started out debate knowing a lot about international relations.
Well,
I just
same.
felt, I do feel like I've gotten to know more about it eventually. But even then, even when I didn't know much, I felt like it was very intuitive, uh, understanding. Because it's not about, it is about knowing, but it's also about just analyzing behavior, how different organizations work, how different forces can pull or push each other. So if you have an almanac, you at least remind yourself that you're not going to enter around without any pronouns or without any objects. You can at least name drop some organizations. You don't because I think at the end, whenever you're new, the one thing that really makes you underperform in IR motions is feeling like you don't know any, and then it shows and it manifests. But at least if you're a newbie and you have something to wrap around your head from, whether it's just a factoid in a page, that can help. The other thing is get get in the habit of just reading headlines, even if you don't really invest so much time in it. Just be aware of what's happening. I think it's a growing process, and then eventually it'll all pan yourself out. And of course, listen to enriching discussions, because I also had to learn all of this, hearing other people describe and simplify it for me. Very clever lectures, and it doesn't have to be a debate source. It could be lectures that you see online. What international relations 101 on YouTube, or listen to podcasts like Debatable. So
Oh,
so
shucks, kidding.
so you can also, like, it's really about just not being too intimidated by it, because at the end of the day, debate is about persuasion. So you need to persuade yourself first before you can
Ooh,
persuade others. Yeah.
I like that. I like that. Thank you so much. So you heard it here. Please matter load everyone, and
Get an
just
almanac,
get an almanac.
but
Read up
but
more.
don't open it like round one. Read
Yeah,
beforehand.
read it beforehand. I think is the most important thing. So once again, Jano, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day for this and for helping us with this tournament. We really appreciate it. So that's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye bye.